Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Debt Nation, where we are busy putting death out of business. And I've got Andrew Reynolds here, ready to rock and roll on some Australian economic news and some other topics on bells and whistles and other cool things. We all remember Andrew Reynolds from one of the very first shows I ever did, where we talked about monetary theory and banking and a bunch of cool stuff. So I really appreciate you coming back on. But first, let's just thank our sponsors. Let's thank Thrivous. That's Thrivous. That's $5 all the way up to $160 worth of free geoprotectors and nootropics. If you want some, you know the rules. Share the link around. Also, I am Transhuman. Thanks to David Kelly for sponsoring this episode. Andrew, how are you?
Fine, thanks. It's interesting being at home for a few weeks.
Yeah, it's been kind of crazy. Hey, so, are you following the government's directives and all that, or are you being a rebel and going outside every now and again?
I'm going outside every now and again, but in WA, it's the directives aren't quite those of Victoria, so we're not quite as locked down.
Yeah. WA went hard and fast, right? They went really hard and really fast. Victoria was a bit slow, but it's quite draconian here as compared to the rest of the country. But hard and fast seems to have worked, right?
Yeah, we didn't have as many people coming in any case, so it was from an odd point of view. The tourism industry being fairly slow here at the time was a good thing. Mm-hmm. So we didn't have as many, and we didn't have the cruise ships coming in.
Yeah, the cruise ships, the Diamond Princess, all of that has been an absolute disaster. It's interesting to see, and it's not just the cruise industry. I mean, COVID-19 must be really real, because I've noticed that in the US, it's put one of their super carriers out of action. That's nuts. So people who say it's nothing, you don't put one of your biggest warships out of action. So there's definitely stuff going on, and it's not much fun. But yeah, Victoria, it's really weird. I mean, I'm here in Melbourne, and, everything is shut. I mean, it's been shut for a while now. I'm kind of getting used to it. It shouldn't be like that. But it's just kind of odd to think that, this is perpetually quiet. It feels like Christmas all the time, Christmas Day all the time.
It does. It's kind of odd being able to drive out of my house onto a highway and being able to just drive straight out, turn over the road, and not worry that much about the traffic. Normally, getting out in the morning, if there's school traffic going on, it's impossible to get across for minutes. At the moment, it's sort of look left, look right, and drive across.
Yeah, I mean, without with the economic aspect removed, it's actually quite. I don't mind it. I honestly don't mind it. Like, it's nice having a bit of a relaxed atmosphere. But at the same time, the devastating economic consequences, which is what I guess we'll get into, are piling up, and the government's response to these to the economic the economic impacts. So let's talk about that. Shutting everything down, shutting all the small businesses down, shutting all the hospitality, tourism, everything that's happened. I mean, what have you seen in terms of the economic impact? Job Seeker has been, they've put Job Seeker up, the payment up, and they've introduced a big one, a Job Keeper, in order to try and hold people over on payroll. Do you think these were good? What do you think? What do you see about the economy?
To me, the economy is about creating wealth, and that's production, getting out there, building things, making things. That's what's an economy for. It's to allow the humans within it to interact. Shutting down that interaction, shutting down that business is always going to cause a huge problem. And simply turning the money printers on isn't a good way to solve that, because otherwise we could all sit at home and the government would give us all $1 million that they printed, and all of a sudden we'd be wealthy. It doesn't work that way. But as a temporary measure, there's certainly been worse ones around the world. Working as I do a lot with the UK, the way the UK is dealt with is a bit of a shocker, whereas the Australian way has been much better. But I'd still rather that they say, okay, it's okay to go back to work now and get on with it.
Do you think that businesses should be allowed to decide on their own whether or not they should be shut down, or do you agree that generic sort of closing of whole industrial sectors is the way to go?
I never think that it's okay for the government to step in and shut down whole industrial sectors. To me, the function of a government in a pandemic like this is to give advice, and to say, look, one of the things that you do with any disease, any viral disease that affects the lungs, is to maintain that social distancing, to give that separation between you and the person next door, and the person you're standing next to. And that sort of advice, wash hands, all the usual things, is great advice, and it's stuff that I've been keeping to. And from my point of view, I've been largely staying away from anyone else. But as an introvert, that's a fairly easy thing for me to do. It's not something that worries the heck out of me. But this idea of shutting the whole thing down is, I think, a fairly hefty overreaction. But I should say that while it is an overreaction on a disease point of view, I think politically they didn't really have many other choices.
Yeah, disease. It's once you get into that vector of disease talk, doctors become the overarching lords and masters, and arguably so. That's a good idea. But they don't really have much of an economic consequence, economic idea. It's
like that letter from the 220, I think, economists that said we need to continue with the lockdowns. The economy doesn't matter. What matters is health. When you look through the list, almost every single one of them is an academic in a tenured position. So they've got very safe jobs, mostly government funded. And they're never really going to suffer through this. They might have might find it difficult to buy things, or they may not be able to get their toilet paper together. But they're not going to be in the situation that most businesses are, where you're having to lay off staff that you really want to keep working, but you know that if you don't, the business is going to fail, and if the business fails, they're not going to have a job.
Yeah, and that's the big thing. It's kind of this tyranny of a sort of the academic class in a way that don't really. There's this sort of they're aloof, they're disconnected from the real economy and the mums and dads. And the funny thing I found with this whole in here and in the United States and everywhere I've looked, because it's bureaucracies, because it's bureaucratic, because it's very reactionary, and because COVID-19 happens so quickly, the arbitrary nature of how they shut things down and what they shut down, it was very staggered. It was very crazy. It was very weird. And so you've had big businesses that have allowed to function almost without go on. So Woolworths and Coles and IGA have been.
The mining sector in WA has been allowed to continue, even though they're spending a lot of time close to each other while you're mining.
Yeah, so I just found the way that they've done this is been quite unfair, and I noticed little coffee shops around the show. Like I talked to business owners around, and I said, why did you shut down and why did these people not? And they said, well, we were given a directive to shut down because we couldn't do takeaways and this, and then a week later we could, but by then we'd already let people off, and so because there wasn't much of a, and I don't mean of course the government has to react, but in a certain way. But because there wasn't much of a directive, the government didn't have much of a plan or anything, they left. And because everything was kind of so sudden, the chaos was actually much greater than it probably could have been. I
mean, I was working on a project in Canberra at the time. I'd been there for nearly a month. Made all sorts of promises to the clients to say we're going to be able to finish this job, but then WA said that look, we're going to be closing the borders, imposing quarantine restrictions if you come in. Either come home now or don't bother for however long it is. And there's no way I could stay away from my family for that long. So back home I went, leaving the client with a nearly finished but not serviceable platform.
It's strange. It's just strange to think that. And what do you think? What do you think about the economic activity now? Do you think that Australia is heading? I mean, I've seen the RBA is talking about 10% GDP shock, maybe happening. The biggest depressing month happening next month.
I'd be surprised if it was only 10%.
Surprised?
Yeah.
Why is that? That's 10% is shocking.
10% is shocking, but closing down a large number of businesses and having a huge number of people not working is, to me, it's going to be at least that. GDP doesn't pick everything up. I have serious issues with GDP as a measure, but actual wealth creation has been knocked by more than 10%.
Is that because because they're talking about June being the worst month of this, and it's because, you know, what are we in now? April, you still have some economic activity. May, you'll have the winding up of the belts. The people will tighten their spending. I mean, you had a lot of panic buying, which is still going on in a small way now. It's winding up now. The panic buying is starting to wind up. Do you agree with this assessment?
Still difficult to get hand sanitizer. I'm hoping that by then they're starting to open things back up again. I'm looking forward to getting back to work as soon as I possibly can. But at the moment, I can't plan. I can't sort out saying, you know, I need parts for what I'm working on delivered at this time. I've just got to say, look, can you make them up and hold them for me? And when I'm ready, I'll come and grab them. But there's not a lot I can do at the moment. It's really frustrating.
That's I'm not sure whether or not you get your parts from overseas, but you know, we're still struggling with manufacturing being offline in China, with a lot of delayed orders. Some manufacturing is starting back up, but again, they might be setting themselves up for a second wave. And you know, once it gets into China, it gets incredibly hard to contain, as exhibited
or for that matter, India. India, sub-Saharan Africa, and so forth. They're not areas that are that make social distancing that easy, or are even likely to pay much attention to it.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the lack of statistics just comes down to a lack of testing kits and a lack of just a lack of testing in those areas. I think that they don't have the proper statistics. I would be very surprised if this wasn't ripping through in a much greater way than we're seeing statistically. I think the statistics might be higher in Western countries simply because the testing is higher, and
It's also that we do have a much older population than many in India and Africa and South America, for that matter. We will be disproportionately affected because we've managed to progress our health systems to the point where people are getting old and getting old reliably. And normally this is a good thing, and it is a good thing. But it means that when we have a virus that disproportionately affects the elderly, we're going to get hit by it disproportionately.
Yeah, and that's disturbing. Yeah. So this economic number, this 10%, and you're saying it's going to be worse. What do you think that means for? What do you think that means? Because, you know, I'm born 1993, so obviously I've never seen any sort of contraction of the economy ever. People who were born in the 50s probably never seen an economic contraction in Australia. No, I'm kidding. It's a joke. But for the most part,
I was born in the 60s, and we have.
we're known as the lucky country for a reason, right? And one of these reasons is economically we've done okay. Through the GFC, we didn't see much of it.
We've actually done staggeringly well. I mean, and all credit where it's due. The reforms that Hawke and Keating launched in '85, and have really opened the economy up and meant that we haven't had to suffer from much since then. The work under Howard to get the federal budget under control once again has meant that we're able to make this, the spending that is currently going on, which I disagree with, but it's happening. At least it's not going to destroy our ability to produce and to borrow into the future, because our debt is so much lower than almost any other OECD nation. We are in a very, very privileged and lucky position. But that privilege and luck has happened over the last few decades through governments that have done things that are reasonably sensible.
Yeah, and getting that debt, they make fun of, like, a lot of the people I talk to who are on the Labor Greens side of the spectrum, they made fun of the Libs for the debt and deficit talk, saying, this debt and deficit talk is so silly, you should be running up deficits, blah, blah, blah. Well, they've got their wish now. Okay, so you've got your wish now. So you've got about 300 billion of debt on the books now, on the government. So you've got your wish. It's here. And do you think that JobKeeper is a good idea, that you should keep people on their payroll? There might be, there's Virgin and Qantas also. Yep. I think they're thinking of Virgin and Qantas in the same way as America is thinking of their bailouts, in terms of a national security idea, so they don't, so it doesn't, so a foreign country or company can't snap up some cheap assets. Virgin obviously being owned by a lot of overseas interests, though.
Yes.
What do you think about Virgin Qantas?
I'll go back to the start with the JobKeeper first.
Mm-hmm.
Our firm works a lot in the UK, and I said earlier that the system there is one that is, frankly, it's awful. The idea there is that you can only access the payments to maintain your employees if they're all furloughed. So we've had to lay off every single one of our employees, or almost all of them, so that we can actually get the money from the government. The JobKeeper scheme is a much better one, where at least the idea is that they continue working. Because as I said earlier, the whole point is to create wealth and to give people, be able to do things and interact and so forth. The UK system said, we're not going to pay you unless you're doing nothing, which to me is just silly, because you've then got the whole thing stopped. Everyone's let go, the business stops, and you can't do anything. Whereas the Australian system at least said, well, you can only get these payments if you keep them working, if you keep them on your payroll, and you pay them, we pay you for paying them, and they're free to work while doing so. That's a much better idea than the idea that they've got to be sitting at home on their backsides doing nothing in order to get this payment.
Yeah, it sounds silly, because then you got to rehire. Rehiring is a whole headache of bookwork and costs and insurance and everything else, and super and everything. Well, whatever they've got in the UK. It's a whole regime. Whereas keeping people on the books is more simple. It gets the economy ready to go whenever. If the economy restarted right now, everyone moves again. If it starts in a week, if it starts in a month, a year, however long, whatever's left on that tether, everybody gets moving again in tandem. Yeah. If it's staggered, it's staggered.
You keep it in the UK. You keep everyone on your books, but they're just not allowed to do anything. They're not allowed to work. They can't work from home. They can't do anything to help business. Sorry, yeah. So it's. We've just had to say to everyone, we need to preserve cash. This isn't any particular company in the UK. It's everyone. We need to preserve cash so that when the business restarts, we've got money here to start again. So go home and do nothing. And to me, that's a huge waste. It's virtually every industrial firm in the UK has had to stop working not even have anyone on site, because you can't guarantee that you're going to be able to keep cash.
Right,
And
I
the only
see.
way to do that is to send them home.
Yeah, that's kind of silly because at least here in
Yeah,
Australia, I mean, you could go and do Uber or you could do, whatever. You
yeah,
stock shelves or
yeah. You can stock shelves. You can clean the warehouse. You can do stock take, maintain. Pardon me, maintaining social distancing, of course, but you can keep working. You can keep doing things in the business. I'd pardon me. I'd love to have people doing things like inventory and cleaning things up and tidying and putting away and all the rest of it, but they're not allowed to be in the firm.
right. Interesting. And Qantas and Virgin bailouts, rescues, whatever words you want to use. What do you think of these initiatives, these ideas?
I'm categorically opposed to bailing either Qantas or Virgin out, and I'm saying that as someone with a lot of Qantas points sitting there. But no, there's no way the government should be involved in bailing them out. To me, the aircraft will still be there, the trading name will still be there and have some value. The staff will still be there. So the idea that you should hand them, as Virgin was asking for, 1.4 billion, either as a gift or a loan, is laughable. Virgin's problems are well documented, and I know everyone knows exactly what they are. They had too much debt, so debt's a useful thing, but like anything else, if you've got way too much of it, then it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, to me, if they are going to fail, they should be allowed to fail. And when everything's picking back up again, they're going to be able to get the aircraft back. Maybe only the half the fleet that they actually own, but the debt's gone, and the aircraft and people are still there. So, and when people want to fly again, those aircraft will be back in the air.
Yeah, and I can't. A lot of people are missing flying. You see memes around everywhere of people pretending to be on planes. It's kind of funny. People want to fly again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another economic policy that they brought in is an assets test. They're reviewing all foreign asset purchases essentially. To protect cheapened Australian assets. One, because of the rapid decline in the Australian dollar versus pretty much all other currencies, and the other is we might have an impending housing. The housing bubble might pop, or at least it might take a bit of a downward hit to its meteoric rise. I mean, it's going to be relative, I think. I mean, compared to being one of the most expensive housing markets in the world, especially here in Melbourne and Sydney.
In Sydney, yeah.
What do you think about the foreign review on foreign assets being purchased in Australia, and we'll talk about housing after that.
In some ways, I'm ambivalent about it. Generally, I would say that reviewing foreign purchases is a bad thing. I've seen so many times where people coming into this country have bought assets at what they think is a fair price, but the Australians are sort of laughing at them and saying, you've way overpaid for this asset. Because if I thought it was worth that much, I would have bought it for that. So I'm generally opposed to it, but I can understand at the moment with the shutdowns in effect, you really don't want people coming in with buying, doing the buying on the cheap thing.
Yeah, buying tracts of real estate, or especially there's a lot of commercial real estate that's just sitting there losing value as we speak. Just tick tock. I'm watching even here in Melbourne. I'm watching the lease signs race up, lease, like every second place.
Yeah.
And it was bad before. I was thinking, when I drove up and down, went up and down the street, there was a lot of shops already saying for lease, a lot of pressure on retail, falling foot traffic, and competing with online sales already, and just not enough of product diversity. Really, we're running out of sort of product diversity, and
But
so
then
there's a lot of
I think in some ways you've hit on the other issue, the other side of the coin. There is that there was a lot of issues before this, so that the land was losing value prior to this. If a foreigner walks in and starts buying up huge tracts of it, they're probably going to lose their money in 5 years or so. I saw it in the 1980s when the Japanese were buying up large tracts of the Gold Coast and Surfers Paradise, and they paid massively over what an Australian was normally happy to pay for that sort of land. And then within 5-6 years, most of the firms that had bought it had gone bankrupt, lost out, and walked away. And Australians had bought the land again bought the land again at a much cheaper price, with a net gain to Australia. So I can understand the desire to wanting to stop now, and I feel a lot for it. But in the end, you've got to take a longer term view of this and say, well, maybe in 5 years, if they're likely to have got it wrong. Surely we understand our own real estate better than someone coming in from, say, China or Japan or whatever else, and we've got a better idea of how much that's worth. Is that going to be a good move? Stopping them buying things, by stopping them handing us a lot of money and then walking away with nothing 5 years from now.
Yeah, and the thing is, with Australia, we've got a pretty low population and a lot of unused land. So I guess we could just always make a new street somewhere if we always want to just build a new street. But that reminds me,
it's not as if they can take a building or a piece of land over to China and use it over there. It's still here and it's still being used.
Yeah, it reminds me, the Japanese thing you just mentioned, purchases, reminds me of Japan when they were purchasing the Rockefeller Center in America, and the Americans all had a heart attack. But the Rockefeller Center owners, they said, hey, they're buying this center at like 4 or 5 times its price, for billions and billions of dollars, and it popped. And they lost a lot of money on that center, free market economics usually wins out in the end in an equilibrium. I can understand the logic behind the panic of the government, and it's the Liberals, so the Liberals are not known from shying away from selling to foreigners. They're quite liberal on that policy, so there must be some sort of it's either political or maybe it's economic concern. Maybe they are actually concerned with other things. I mean,
they are also in coalition with the Nationals.
Yeah, it's the National. It's got to be the Nationals. It's got to be. I was talking to Rob Pike about this actually, and yeah, he thinks the Nationals are done. He thinks they're toast for a variety of reasons. Interesting guy, been around politics forever, but.
I wouldn't entirely agree. I mean, they do represent that the rural constituency quite well, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland. They don't do it as well in WA, where the country the Liberals are a very effective representative of the country in Perth, but in northern New South Wales and northern New South Wales and Queensland. They tend to do a really good job of representing the rural electorates that the Liberals there don't do as well.
Yeah, but with the fishers and shooters have been coming up a lot in New South Wales. There, been doing quite well. But I mean, what rural place do you have in WA anyway? Really, the only rural population you have is in the south, right?
Oh, no. There's a large wheat belt that runs all the way from Geraldton to Albany. So that's 1,000 kilometres of wheat belt, and it's about 150 kilometres wide. So it's just not highly populated like say northern New South Wales is, because our farmers long ago went for efficiency and very large farm sizes. So a lot of the rural towns, like the one that York, Muckamboodin, and then towards the south, are much smaller than they were in the 1920s and 1930s, because the farms are so much larger now.
Yeah, I had a real privilege of when I came to Liberty Fest, I think this time last year or something, around about that time anyway, had a real privilege of coming and having a look at the WA Parliament and the seating composition and the Senate and the House of Reps. Really fascinating building, fascinating place. I was
It is.
surprised
I
to
mean,
learn that
one side is colonial and the other side is 1950s, 1960s design.
yeah, and it's not as half as big as they wanted it to be because there was a deflationary depression thing that happened and the building size got downside. It was really cool to learn about that. I really had a great time there. But yeah, so the Liberals doing better in the marginal in the rural seats out there. Very interesting to know.
There's only one or two federal seats out in the wheat belt here. Again, because of the low population density, and it used to be all in one seat called O'Connor while Wilson Tucky was there, old Iron Bar Tucky. But it's now been split into two, the south and the north, and then they cover across into the mining areas as well. So it's not nearly as purely rural in character as it used to be.
Yeah, and the mining is obviously the big talking point. It's what a lot of it, and there's a lot of economic hope for WA into the future. I think WA, out of this crisis, WA will probably be one of the strongest states, lurching ahead.
Oh yeah, no doubt of that.
Yeah, especially with a lot of we've had a lot of doctors coming on here. We're talking about critical resources, things like lithium, and a whole bunch of the critical resources. And WA is just stacked. I've been reading reports and reports and reports, and you end up finding out that they got more critical resources in WA than they have worth of traditional mining. In terms of monetary value, coal and all the normal
coal and we have huge amounts of iron ore and coal, but when you look at the mineral sands and, as you said, lithium and all the rest of it, uranium, huge quantities of all of that. And while we keep looking, we keep finding.
Yeah.
Largely because we've got some of the oldest, literally some of the oldest crust on the planet here. When you go up to some of the areas up north, you're swimming in rock pools in 3 billion year old rock sort of stuff.
Wow. Are you on board with nuclear energy, by the way? Nuclear
absolutely.
Power? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good. Yeah.
I can see the economic argument against it because it's hugely intensive, but I don't have any problem with with anything else about it.
Yeah, because we got nuclear physicists who come on here all the time trying to figure out how Australia could actively lobby to get some nuclear power going here, because we've got a safe environment, we got a highly skilled workforce, and you don't even need a highly skilled, but we have one anyway.
Yep.
We have the technology, we have America and Canada and nuclear powers as friends, we have India as a friend, we have all the uranium, we have no earthquake zones. We don't live on a continental plate. You could build it in fairly safe locations. There's these things called breeder reactors. The breeder reactors can sustain this uranium for thousands of years, so the nuclear waste argument disappears. I am looking for people.
While we've got the geological stability we have, we can dig down, and WA has the mining expertise. We can dig literally kilometres down into the crust, seal up any waste that does happen to get created, and the chances of anyone stumbling across it in the next million years or so is so remote as not to be worth watching or worrying about.
Yeah, and we've got reusable rockets like you see behind me. We could always shoot it off into space as well. That's getting cheaper and cheaper all the time. They're trying to bring that down to a $10,000 launch cost, which is nothing. So you could just even end up shooting it off into space. But breeder reactors means you could just reuse this material for up to 10,000 years. So it's perpetual energy for essentially. I mean, it's enough.
I'm not so sure about putting it into space, but there's because there's plenty of places on the Earth where you don't even need to spend the $10,000 per kilo to get it out of the planet. So to me, there's just no real issue there. I can see the economic issue, but as the new smaller reactor designs come on board, I don't think even that's going to stand up.
And because you know a lot about the Australian economic liberty people. Do you know? And a lot of those. There's a split in that community, but for the most part, a lot of those lean on the side of pro-nuclear. Is there more energy? Is there energy? Is there any energy there?
Politically, it's very difficult. As soon as anyone comes out and says, I support nuclear energy, you tend to get jumped on by the political left. But I think even there's some movement coming. When you look at the Greens parties around the world, some of them are starting to look at saying, well, maybe our opposition to nuclear was short-sighted. But I think it's going to be a fairly long process to get both the left and the right agreeing on this. The right knows that it's a bit of a political live rail. You don't want to touch it because it's too dangerous, and at the moment, economically, it'd be very tricky. But to me, the Liberal Party at least is leaving the door open to it without specifically saying we're not going to do it. They're just saying we don't want to touch this at the moment, and I think that's a position that politically they have to take.
Yeah, and as you know, you mentioned the Green Party overreacting, and the Greens usually do this. The left usually does this a lot, where they overreact to what's perceived wrong, and they don't look at, I think places like Germany that functioned for a long time very happily on nuclear power, and then building up in the background, you've got climate issues that the Greens take very seriously, but they say don't use coal, but they don't offer an alternative, because offering wind and solar is not a real alternative. It's not a real alternative. It chews up less than 1% of the world energy, or they create less than 1% of the world energy combined. I mean, solar is going to be a very powerful thing in the future. Go long on solar power, very long on solar power, but only as a capitalist idea, because it's not a real short-term solution, and they are.
It has those storage issues that are still pretty expensive. I mean, the lithium-ion batteries that are needed, that most of the people who have solar have in their houses, are not exactly environmentally sensitive or sustainable. And a lot of them use a lot of the strategic minerals coming out of Central Africa that are acquired under circumstances that, if they knew what they were doing, they probably wouldn't actually buy those batteries. Because it's getting the stuff out of Congo's is not. I'd say it's deeply problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like the blood diamonds of old, It's with the new, I know exactly what you mean, and they're all shipped around the world and produced in China or wherever, But I think there should be a real. I agree with you. I think it's going to be really hard to get the left and the right to talk about nuclear, especially now. Economic problems and things like that will be dominant. But I think nuclear really should be something on the menu, at least in Australia. Especially when it comes to the environment. It's a very good energy generator concerning the environment. I find.
Yeah, the usual scare tactic that is used is to say, well, where are you going to put them? And as soon as where are you going to put the nuclear reactors? And then you can say the left can say get all hand wavy about putting them near the cities, because you need to be able to transmit the power over AC, which means that it can't go more than at most 1,000 kilometres from the consumer to still have a decent amount of oomph when it gets there. So it's an easy tactic to take, and it's the one that they frequently do. But I'm actually thinking, reading about the potential of high voltage DC to transmit power over much longer distances. and also mean that you don't need to have these eyesore power lines, huge high tension power lines sitting up in the air, because HVDC doesn't interact that much with its surroundings. So you could even bury the power lines, something you can't do with AC. So as that develops, it'll be an interesting thing, because then you could put the nuclear plants in Central Australia or on the Great Australian Bight or wherever you wanted to put them, and Groot Uitland if you wanted to, and you'd still be able to get meaningful power down to Sydney, Melbourne, for that matter, Perth.
Wow, that's really interesting. So before we go, I'm going to push you back you up into a corner here, and I'll ask you a difficult question. I'm going to say, what the hell is going on with banking in the world, either in Australia or in the world? What the heck is going on, Andrew Reynolds?
That's a
where
good
do we
question.
start? I don't know where to start.
I don't know either. The central banks have been, to me, doing things that have been insane for a long time. And government regulations have been having the banks do even more bonkers things. And to me, the banks are just being pushed left, right, and centre. And I know it's not a popular view that the poor banks, they're not doing well, because in Australia at least they certainly are doing well. But when you look around the world, most of the banks are not making a huge amount of money, and I'm looking at it thinking we're going to pay for this somehow. I'm just not sure exactly how.
Are we looking at, is COVID-19 a financial problem? Is it a financial problem?
It's
definitely
become a
an
financial
economic
problem.
problem.
It's become a
the
financial
GFC
problem.
was definitely a financial problem. That was about mortgage-backed securities, right? And them going sour.
Yep.
Is COVID-19 a financial problem?
Oh, it certainly is. Because a lot of the banks lending to businesses lend on what's called cashflow lending, where they take a view on what your cash flow is going to be into the future, and lend you a proportion of that. So you're going to if you go out and buy this equipment, you'll be able to increase your production or reduce your costs, and therefore the benefit to the business is this. And so we'll lend you enough to go and buy the equipment, or we'll lend you 50% of the cost of the equipment, that sort of thing. So that sort of cash flow lending is fairly common. But all of a sudden the banks look at this and say, well, your cash flows dropped to virtually zero. You haven't been able to get the benefit out of this equipment. How are you going to repay the loan? And frequently the answer is going to be, well, we can't. When your local cafe, to keep it reasonably simple, your local cafe goes to the bank saying, well, we've got a good business here, but getting a brand new coffee making machine will cut costs by 10% and allow us to increase production, increase the number of coffees we're serving by 20-30% or whatever. We can do more takeaways and so forth. And the bank says, yep, we can see all that. We see your projections. We're happy with that. We'll lend you 50% or 100% or whatever it is of the value of that coffee maker, so that you can sell more coffees. And then the government steps in and says, sorry, you're not allowed to sell coffees, or you're not allowed to have people dining in. You can only do takeaways, which cuts your business. That drastically drops the ability of the business to repay its loan. And if the business goes bankrupt or shuts its doors, the bank loses out, because they're not going to be able to sell that coffee maker onto someone else now.
Yeah, and you have that ripple effect. And I guess, it makes sense in Australia with the JobKeeper payment to try and keep some of the money velocity happening, because a lot of people in Australia, for example, have a lot of debt. They have car loans, they have house loans and mortgages and everything else. And if you cut out their work, I mean, that's not their fault. I mean, the people, it's not like they went unemployed, or they didn't turn up to work, or they were late, or whatever. That's not really their problem.
Yeah, they were told they're not allowed to do what they're not allowed to earn money.
Yeah. So, but they still have those loans they still exist, right? And I mean, there was a lot of talk, to try and defer loan payments and a lot of the other stuff. But this all puts a lot of pressure on every aspect of the financial system, right? I mean, it puts pressure on lenders, it puts pressure on with the creditors and the debtors, it puts pressure on governments. Who?
Yeah, I mean, with the GFC, it was fairly easy to see who was going to suffer from it. All you had to do was think about how it was put together, how it was integrated. When the government puts pressure on banks to go out and lend as much as they can to people who are unlikely to be able to pay it back, and then promises that this is what happened in the GFC, then promises that the government will guarantee those loans no matter what. You can easily see that the banks aren't going to suffer that much. I mean, they will suffer, but they're not going to suffer that much unless they've got a lot of this script on their books. So the banks that had been buying all of the mortgage-backed securities were the ones that ultimately went down. The ones that had made the loans continued on in business because they'd sold those loans on. And the insurance companies that have been insuring those loans were also left in a very bad place. So it was fairly easy to see where that would kick out. But this one, who knows? It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it is. And, what do you think about the strategies from central banks, let's say the Federal Reserve, in Australia, because we've known about this for a long time. They print money, they buy mortgage, they buy a lot of assets, they've been buying a lot of the bonds, the yield curve inverted, etc. I mean, we've been seeing this in America for a long time, but in Australia, we've only just started to see some money printing here. This is kind of new for Australians. Everyone's saying, what's all this quantitative easing? What's all this? I mean, in America, we've been talking about this for 10 years or more, probably more, but at least in my experience, 10 years. But in Australia, this is only very new on the plate of policies. What do you think about the strategies of central banks printing money, quantitative easing, and buying a lot of the bonds and stuff? Do you agree?
I'm almost always categorically opposed to central banks printing money. I think that it's a silly thing to do. It's a very interesting idea that the reaction to stopping things being produced is to create more money. Money to me is a tool used to buy things that are produced. So if there's a lot that's being produced and a lot more money floating around, then you're only going to end up with inflation. To me, the staggering thing that happened out of the whole GFC and the quantitative easing was the lack of consumer inflation. It just seemed very odd, but mostly in that case, it was a simple money go round happening in the US, where the federal government. The federal government spent money, the Treasury printed money, the Federal Reserve printed money, and the Treasury did a swap of one for the other. So it kicked out into asset price inflation, fairly massive asset price inflation, but not into consumer price inflation, largely because the Chinese kept producing things at cheaper and cheaper prices. And that's why it kicked out into assets rather than into consumer price. But this time, I don't think the Chinese are going to be producing quite as much again, and there's a fairly strong resistance a political resistance to buying more from China.
Yeah, and we're going to. Well, sorry.
So to me, it's I'm worried about making predictions, but once again, I'll say it's going to look like inflation.
Do you mean asset inflation, or do you mean price inflation?
Asset inflation, almost certainly.
But consumer deflation, right? I mean, we're looking at a deflation in consumer prices, aren't we? Because
no, I very much doubt that. We'll see a short-lived deflation while people are reacting to the lack of people buying things. Buying wine at the moment is a wonderful thing. Most of the wineries are selling things that, they're desperate for cash. Selling things at 40 and 50% off. It's great. My cellar's going to increase over the next few weeks quite substantially, but I don't think that'll last. I think that cash will move from being king to being something that is not really something anyone needs to worry about because they're printing so much of it.
Really? So cash from king to something else. All right, that's good news. That's good. That's interesting. I need to think about that quite quickly.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm right either, but because it's who knows. Hasn't. This sort of episode just hasn't been seen before.
No.
I'm normally hesitant to say these things haven't been seen before because as soon as the novel coronavirus started being talked about, people said, "Oh, this hasn't happened before," and I just picked up a quick history book and looked at the Spanish flu. Of course, it's happened before, but having governments react the way that they are to it is unprecedented. When the Spanish flu came out, the governments were starting to try and recover from World War One, and all of them still had classical economics backgrounds. So the whole thing was over with it. As soon as the Spanish flu died out in early 1920, we ended up with the Roaring Twenties, where governments had cut back their spending, were paying down the debt from World War One, and the economy boomed. As it happened, it overboomed, and we got the recession and then the depression caused by, again, the US federal government. But who knows what's going to happen out of this? If I was just an impartial observer, it'd be fascinating to watch. But being in business at the moment, you've got to try and work it out, and that's a whole other area.
Yeah, that's really frustrating. Well, we really appreciate your time on the show. It's just it's unprecedented. It's this new Keynesian new monetary theory, this modern monetary theory as they call it. The whole premise of it is kind of silly. It's the fact that you can print as much as you want because you can tax, which creates demand for your currency, which means that because you create that demand, your currency is always legitimate regardless of how much you print. That doesn't make, because you still have supply and demand in money markets, and so
money is a commodity like any other. The only difference with it is that the government can create it.
Yeah, and because it's trust based, if they lose confidence in the currency, regardless of whether or not you're using it, you're taxing in it. It's because people just create underground markets, and we saw this. I've seen this all over the world, but I've seen it in Venezuela. I've seen it in Iran. A big one. They used just underground markets took off and become larger than the actual economy.
Zimbabwe, where they were handing out $1 trillion notes. It's and I well remember walking into an ice cream shop in Fremantle, and someone had tipped them with a trillion Zim dollar note because it was worth only a few cents.
I know a lot of the professors think they're really smart.
The basic idea of MMT is it has some intellectual merit. I mean, the basic idea is that the government, because it is issuing currency, can print as much of it as it wants and spend it, and that's correct. So you can then say, well, the way they stop up the inflation is through taxation. And that's also correct. I mean, they can, if you want to cut it one way or the other, that makes some sense. But ultimately, you've got to balance your spending with your taxation. Whether you say there's a causal link between the two is really just semantics. And to me, that's the core error of modern monetary theory. That they're saying that you can spend because you're not linked to your taxation, but the taxation is used to sop up any inflationary pressure that results from any overspending you're doing.
Yeah, and the big thing is that America is the special circumstance because it has a world reserve currency and it can export its excess inflation to the rest of the world, right? And that's
the last time a nation tried to do that was the UK with sterling,
with the sterling.
and once they started overdoing it, which they did in the 20s and into the 30s, and started really playing around with their currency, they lost that global reserve.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that like quantum mechanics in some ways, you can govern one or the other. You can't have both.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you want to have the global reserve currency, you've got to have a global reserve, one that is reasonably stable in value and people trust it. As you said, it's a trust issue.
Yeah.
And once people lose trust in it, they're going to be searching around for another asset class. And whether that's renminbi yuan or the yen or the euro, they'll do it.
Yeah, and that's
gold,
I think that's
gold.
the thing. Like that, maybe it would work. Maybe modern monetary theory does have some merit in Australia, but it's a special case in the United States. And I think what they do is they transfer that idea to a non-reserve currency thinking, and they don't listen to Charles de Gaulle when he calls it the exorbitant privilege. And I think that's
to me, as I said, it's one of those things that it's intellectually interesting. Is there a direct link between the two? Great, could be, might not be. Good intellectual argument. But as soon as you start trying to exploit it, you lose it.
Interesting.
The Phillips Curve, for example, where they were saying there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Well, there was for a long time until someone pointed out that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and the government started trying to use it to push down unemployment by creating inflation. As soon as they did that, the Phillips Curve evaporated. It became a straight line out from the origin.
Yeah, it sounds like anything the government tries to do, that sort of ends up working in the reverse. It's a blunt instrument, the government.
Yep. Whoops. Sorry, that's the problem of working from home. Our dogs.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, I really appreciate your time coming on the show. And it's going to be interesting for everybody around the world. I mean, unemployment is racing up in America. Huge numbers of unemployment. And it's going to be interesting here. Hopefully we get a vaccine or something happens on the health side, and this all unwinds, and we can all go back to life.
I'm not too hopeful on a vaccine though. They've been trying for a coronavirus vaccine since SARS and MERS came out, and they haven't found one yet where the vaccine is better than the disease.
Then what is this just going to go on perpetually forever? And this is the new normal. What the hell does that even mean? It's kind of.
I don't know. The other question is, does getting the virus confer immunity? If it doesn't, then it probably is a perpetual motion machine, because we're going to have to worry about what happens from here. Is Australia going to be closed down with 2-week quarantine on the way in and out? On the way in particular. Every time I try to fly overseas, it's this is the unprecedented bit in many ways. How do we get out of it? Because if we're worried about the elderly and we're worried about those who are going to get for it, which obviously we need to be, but we also need to worry about the business where I'm in and you're in and everyone in requires some travel overseas at times. So how do we deal with that?
Absolutely. Andrew Reynolds, absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on the show this morning, taking your time out. Really appreciate your thoughts. Incredibly smart, and all the best with the bells.
That's another fascinating business.
Yeah. I love the Carillion, and I was looking at your posts from Thailand. Was it? Was it Thailand?
No, Singapore.
Singapore. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it looked amazing.
We were putting in a big installation in Singapore. That was fun.
Very, very cool. And I made sure I went and checked out the ones in Perth around the corner there from the Duxton. That was
yep.
Very, very, very cool.
Yes. Yeah, I like those.
Myself and Satya, you remember that guy? Yeah.
Oh yes, yep.
We went out and we had a check out of that installation, and it was great.
Yeah,
and I got all the photos
put
because
it
I haven't had a
in-
read of it yet. Now I'm in quarantine. I took a photo of every single sign around the place so I could read it later.
Yep.
I should go and dig into that history. It looks pretty cool. But thanks
Yeah,
very much.
I put in the 6.5 tonner in there, so it's a heck of a bell, that one.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No
This
worries.
was a really good episode.
Great.
That's Debt Nation, where we're busy putting death out of business. That's Andrew Reynolds, a good friend of mine over in Perth. Banking, economics, everything else. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
You too.